Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning and welcome to the Leadership Institute's January Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. We live in interesting times. This morning in the Washington Times, I read a quote from President Bush yesterday when he was traveling with Senator Ted Kennedy. And the president told Senator Kennedy, and I hesitate to repeat this because we're at breakfast, not only are you a good senator, you're a good man. Now, you have to think about that for a minute. He was, I guess, a guest in Massachusetts at the time. But you have to believe, I refuse to believe anything else, that the president really didn't mean that he thinks Senator Kennedy is a good man. And you have to wonder why he would say such a thing. Well, it's the best I can figure is that it is primarily because he really has in his own makeup the idea that he wants to be bipartisan, and he had success with bipartisan activity when he lived back in Texas. But if you say Senator Kennedy is a good man, the purpose of saying that, no doubt, is that you want to build good relations with folks on the other side. But the news media aren't going to let you get away with that if you are a conservative Republican president. I read the quote in the Washington Times, which does not probably include very many liberal Democrats in its readership. But then I did, as I always do, after I have read the Washington Times thoroughly, I scanned the Washington Post. And do you know, all the liberal Democrats who woke up this morning and read their Washington Post didn't see the quote about Senator Kennedy, you're a good man. And so the impact, think about the impact on this. The statement probably has ruined the breakfast of lots of conservatives, and it doesn't make any liberal Democrat feel any better toward him. We do live in interesting times. In the past year, Leadership Institute trained 3,392 students in 136 schools. We didn't set a record for training last year as we have in all previous years. We would have set a record had it not been for September 11th. We were holding, for example, on the morning of September 11th, a large school in this very room, which ended about 9:30, 10 o'clock, as the building was evacuated due to suggestions from our neighbors across the street, the Defense Intelligence Agency. And schools immediately thereafter had to be canceled because people couldn't fly, and then many people wouldn't fly. Had it not been for that, we would have set another record, and I'm pretty proud of 3,392 students for last year. We placed 109 job seekers through the Employment Placement Service, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is a record year of achievement for our Employment Placement Service, led now for a number of years by the excellent Jim Cromwell. You have before you on the tables, I believe, our 2002 school schedule. I'd ask that you take a moment to review the calendar and consider attending one of our programs or suggesting our programs to people you know who might benefit from them. This is just the first issuance of our calendar of schools. We always add many schools during the course of the year. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you a young man from Lockport, Louisiana, down in the Cajun country, who happens to be my intern currently. His name is Shane Como, C-O-M-E-A-U-X, a Cajun sure enough, and works with Amy Green and me in the President's office. Shane previously worked for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes in the greater Baton Rouge area, and his moving to Washington is his intention, indicates his intention to start a career in public policy. He happens to be living at our house, and he is a good house guest. At our Christmas party, he proved that he's a good Cajun cook because he made an absolutely spectacularly good jambalaya for us. We trust that, like other Louisianians of the conservative bent, he didn't absorb much from Louisiana's shaky past political figures such as Huey Long, David Duke, and Edwin Edwards. He looks forward to learning the proper path to public policy success while here at interning at LI. Shane will give us the offer an invocation and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Shane.
Thank you. Please bow your heads. Lord, we thank you so much for our new year. So many things last year, just things we wouldn't have thought of at the beginning of last year. I'm looking forward to this year, Father. Just continue to lead us towards you in the right path that you want us. God, just continue to bless the works of the Leadership Institute and all that are present here, especially Family Research Council and all that they do, God, pro-family, pro-life issues. God, just everything we do, God, let us be focused on you and look to you for our guidance and direction. In Jesus' name we pray. Y'all please rise for pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shane. Now my pleasure to introduce Christian Roby, who will give us an update on the activities of the programs department. Christian is our schools coordinator here at the Leadership Institute, and he is responsible for recruiting conservative students for most of Leadership Institute's 27 different kinds of programs. Prior to being employed by the Institute, Christian worked for various conservative and free market think tanks, including Cato, Americans for Tax Reform, Foundation for Economic Education, and Citizens for a Sound Economy. This is his second stint with us because he came here and worked with our student publication school before leaving to take a job up at the Foundation for Economic Education. Christian graduated from Virginia Tech with a degree in philosophy and is currently studying law at George Mason University. Christian Roby.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christian Roby. Thank you for that introduction, Morton. Last year, we trained over 1,000 students in our program. The programs department doesn't include grassroots or the YLS. This year, we'll have 15 schools, including our upcoming public relations school, which will be later on this month, January 23rd and 24th. We are also having other schools that we're having our CLS, which is March 17th and 23rd, and we're having a new school that I'd like to alert you to. It's our Effective Legislative Hearing School, coming up February 11th and 12th. The Effective Legislative Hearing School teaches you how to organize a hearing or select and prepare witnesses for that hearing, and make sure that your hearing makes the headlines, prepares your members to question witnesses, just trains your staff to be adequately prepared for a hearing. you should have, as Morton said, there's calendars, and please do call me if you have any questions. The number is on there, and I'd be delighted to help you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for that brief commercial. It is our general practice to have our Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfasts speakers introduced by people to whom the introducer is beholden. That way, we guarantee a good effort on the part of the introducer, and this is no exception, because Genevieve Wood will introduce our speaker. Genevieve is Vice President for Media Relations at the Family Research Council, which our speaker heads. She joined Family Research Council in May of 2001, and she's responsible for creating and implementing the organization's communication strategy and serving as one of its principal spokesmen. Prior to joining the FRC, she served as the director of our Institute's affiliated program, our Center for Print and Broadcast Media. She also worked for America's Voice for 6 years and as an interviewer and commentator, and she served, and this is incredible for a conservative with her background, she served as publicity coordinator for NBC News in New York. Now, Genevieve came here as an intern to the Leadership Institute and stayed in our Sacker intern house. And I do inspections over there from time to time, and I spotted on the wall in her room about a dozen framed magazine covers, all of them featuring NBC News personality Jane Pauley. And when Genevieve saw that I was scrutinizing these things, she hastened to assure me that she is not in sync with Jane Pauley philosophically, but she admires her career path. And when she went off to be the publicity coordinator for NBC News New York, which she got on her merits and just demonstrating that if you really want to do something in life and you've got talent and perseverance, you can achieve it. She went up there and worked. And I asked her, after about 6 months, she came back for a visit, how was the culture shock? She says, well, I expected culture shock, but it was a greater culture shock than I had expected. I says, well, give me an example. She says, well, I got up there to the office and found that there were a lot of nice, friendly people there. I thought it would be easy to make friends. And after I'd been there for a day or two and made some friendships, I asked one of the co-workers to suggest a church to me. And she said, I got a blank look. And this particular staffer said that he or she, I never found out if this one was a he or a she, didn't attend church, and she then started asking other people, and she had asked and she'd asked, and 6 months later she came and she said, as far as I can determine, none of the staff there go to church. Now, not everybody goes to church, and some people go to church, but not every Sunday. But to have a whole major enterprise where you can't find anybody who goes to church is certainly out of the mainstream of America. Well, she stayed there for a time and got her ticket punched at NBC News, came back, and is working now in conservative movement activities. You often see her on television, and when a producer of a program wants an articulate, attractive, philosophically well-based conservative woman, they often call on Genevieve Wood.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I now work with people who I don't know anyone who doesn't go to church. It's been a little bit of a change in pace over the last couple of years. As Morton mentioned, I am now the Vice President of Media Relations for Family Research Council. And so sometimes part of what I do is play damage control. And I'm going to play a little bit this morning first. I know you probably, those of you who've read Ken's bio here, will see that he's a trial lawyer. And I want to assure you, he's still a nice person and a good guy. I've known him since May. I don't know anyone he has sued at Family Research Council yet. We kind of walk on eggshells from time to time. But overall, he's a great guy, not a bad trial lawyer. I'm going to let you read this about Ken's background. I think you'll see from it that he's certainly someone who's committed to conservative principles, pro-life and pro-family principles. But I want to share just a little bit of a kind of a personal experience I've had in that. I've had the opportunity since I've been in D.C. to work for some great leaders, people like Morton Blackwell, who's so good I've actually worked for him twice, people like Paul Weyrich, who are very committed and who are willing to stand up when it's not popular to stand up. And I didn't know Ken prior to going to FRC in May. And shortly after getting there, the stem cell debate became the forefront of the news. I'm sure many of you remember. Prior to September 11th, that was probably the largest story of the year. What will the president do? And having a president in office now who is a friend, quote unquote, or supposed to be a friend to conservatives, it's a little tougher at times to finesse it and work that relationship than it's been over the past 8 years or so. And so the stem cell debate was coming forward and people were beginning to take sides and what were we all going to do. And Ken was not completely new in town, but he hadn't been here for a number of years. And as the president, the debate continued to move forward, but then the president came forth with his decision, which at Family Research Council, we liked a good chunk of the decision, but we didn't think the president went far enough. You saw a lot of leaders in the conservative and pro-life movement, I would say, cave with the president. They gave him the big high five and said, good enough. And Ken didn't do that. Ken was willing to take a stand when other conservative leaders that I would have expected to do the same thing didn't. And I think it was then that I realized what a great man and a great leader Ken was going to be, and that I was very happy that I was at Family Research Council. So I know he's got a lot of good remarks to share with you this morning, and I urge you to pay good attention because I think he's someone that's going to be a rising star in this movement if I have anything to do with it. Ken?
Well, thank you very much, Genevieve, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I am a trial lawyer, I'm sorry. I do have a passion for the sanctity of life, and it's for good reason, and I saw that in evidence just recently. I came up here recently from Tallahassee, where just before I did, the deans of all the medical schools in Florida called a press conference announcing that under pressure from animal rights activists, that they were no longer going to be using white rats for purposes of medical experimentation. They announced that they were going to be using lawyers instead. Now, they gave 3 reasons for that. They said, first of all, the students don't grow attached to the lawyers. I can't remember the second reason. Oh, there are more lawyers than there are white rats. And finally, there are just some things you can't get white rats to do. So when you come up in the profession that I have and you see the implications of what happens when you are a member of an unfavored class, then your interest and passion about the sanctity of life goes way up. Well, I'd like to share with you this morning some reflections on where we are as a country in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks on September 11th. If I were to ask you, as Alan Jackson, the great country singer, has done, where were you when the world stopped turning on September 11th, I have no doubt that you'd be able to identify it immediately. I certainly know where I was. I had just cleared the security station at the House Office Building, preparing to deliver a press conference on the genocide of Christians and animus in the country of Sudan, when the security officer, very intently with her hand over her ear, obviously listening to her radio, looked straight at me and said, "Sir, if I were you, I'd get the hell out of this building right now." Now, I may be from Florida, but in an instant I turned on my heel and exited the building. And as I left the building, I noticed that dozens of people were literally fleeing from the Capitol down the street in my direction. I had no idea what was going on. I thought perhaps there had been a bomb scare in our building because of the topic that we were dealing with, critical of a repressive Muslim regime in the Sudan. But I just didn't know. And I turned to my right and I saw this huge black plume of smoke, which I now know was coming from the Pentagon. And I realized that something was terribly wrong. And then, after collecting my wife from a hotel and returning to the office and meeting with our staff and praying over the situation that we were in, we, like you, became fixated on the television, listening for the latest breaking news of the events of the day. And as we watched the networks replay again and again the crash of United Flight 175 into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, as we watched the subsequent collapse of those twin towers that symbolize America's preeminence in the arena of world commerce, as we witnessed the devastation that shattered thousands of lives at a single instant, I recognized instantly that these acts of madness also shattered certain myths about American life. And so this morning I'd like to share with you some of those myths and reflect on some of the lessons that we are learning, or perhaps more appropriately we might say relearning, in the aftermath of the terror of September 11th. The first myth about American life that I think was shattered was the myth of security. Now, not since the War of 1812 had an invader drawn blood on American soil. In 1814, the British, of course, invaded the Capitol, burned the White House, the Capitol, the Washington Navy Yard, and the Library of Congress. Now, of interest, and you may not fully appreciate it, the War of 1812 was occasioned not just by the impressment of our sailors on the high seas, but also by acts of state-sponsored terrorism. You see, the British had been inciting the Indians to revolt against the frontier of its ever-expanding upstart former colony. And it wasn't until the Battle of New Orleans, when Andrew Jackson soundly thrashed the British, that we brought that chapter in American history to a close. But in the intervening time, with almost 200 years of our country being free from an invasion, with vast oceans on either side, with friendly neighbors above and below, Americans felt secure. And in the process, we became complacent. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and victory in the Cold War, Americans went about downsizing the military, spending the peace dividend, and generally proclaiming peace in our time. We forgot the lessons of history, which include that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, and that there is no last war, only interludes between wars. Complacency became our undoing. But the myth of American security collapsed in the rubble of the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. Now, closely connected to the myth of security was the myth of prosperity and self-indulgence. Surely, as long as America remained prosperous, we would be secure. Indeed, the mantra that came to symbolize the spirit of the age of the 1990s, I think, perhaps was, "It's the economy, stupid," implying that perhaps man really did live just by bread alone. But in the aftermath of the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, we learned very quickly that bank balances and stock portfolios, no matter how big or how diversified, do not protect against all of the uncertainties of the future. For a decade, our culture had focused on capital formation and ignored the evidence of cultural disintegration that was all around us. Rampant abortion on demand, radical homosexual activism, warehousing of the elderly, fatherless homes, skyrocketing divorce rates, serial cohabitation, the plague of pornography, the loss of civility. We put our faith in our material possessions and had neglected the bedrock values which we forgot were the very foundation and source of our prosperity. Since the 1960s, our culture in many respects had been on an ego trip. We defined liberty as the freedom to do what we want, when we want, without regard to the consequences. Do your own thing became our rallying cry. If you want it, buy it. If it feels good, do it. If the baby's inconvenient, kill it. The first duty is to self. The first right is the right of ego. As a culture, we elevated the autonomous individual as the highest ideal, and yet we neglected and allowed to atrophy those social institutions that bind us together: family, church, marriage. We thought we had no problems that money couldn't solve, which is perhaps why we reacted with such unease as we watched the Dow Jones and NASDAQ averages plunge in the aftermath of September 11th. But the myth of prosperity and self-indulgence collapsed along with the World Trade Center and with the Pentagon. And a third myth that I think went up in smoke on September 11th was the myth of immortality. Now, folks, we didn't consciously think that we were immortal, but as a culture, I would suggest to you that we lived in a state of blissful denial, pretending that death really is not the great equalizer that comes for us all. We'd made a fetish of youth, believing that we could forestall the inexorable march of time with liposuction and facelifts. Frustrated in our quest to find the fountain of youth, we began to fund medical research which depended upon the scavenging of parts from the smallest and least among us in an attempt to offset the ravages that time inflicts on the rest of us. We rejected the notion of future awards and divine judgment, acting as if that the existential now is all that there is and all that really mattered. After September 11th, we know better. We know now that life is a fragile thing. And having watched several thousand people die in an instant, we suddenly realize that it can happen to us. The adolescent nature of our culture became embarrassing to us. Some of the things that seemed so important to us on September the 10th now seem profoundly superficial and silly. But in the process of having these myths explode, Americans have embarked, I believe, on a period of great national introspection, and we are learning or relearning some very important lessons. And I believe that we have every reason to be heartened about the future of our country in the aftermath of these cataclysmic events. First of all, we are relearning the important role of faith in preserving a culture. After the attacks on that Sunday, no doubt you found, as I did, that churches were filled to overflowing. And that's been true on virtually every Sunday thereafter. The President declared a National Day of Prayer and Remembrance. The Supreme Court, for heaven's sakes, for the first time in its history, opened the current session with a moment of silence. Bible sales are up 25%. The sale of books on Bible prophecy are up 85%. Rabbi Jacob Goldstein opened his celebration of Rosh Hashanah, the high holy days of the Jewish year, at Ground Zero in New York City and declared, "There are no atheists in foxholes, and we're all in one big foxhole now." And notwithstanding the attempts over the last 40 years of the media and academic elites and federal judges to secularize American society, it was the scriptures that were quoted at funerals and memorial services in the aftermath of the tragedy, not excerpts from the New York Times, not editorials from the Washington Post, and not pages from Darwin's Descent of Man. Pastors and priests were called on to make sense of this monstrous evil. People weren't calling their psychiatrist or psychotherapist or even the psychic hotline. The relevance of our national motto, "In God We Trust," suddenly seemed to become all the more relevant. And we've also relearned the importance of family in our culture. In the aftermath of the events of 9/11, hard-bitten business executives now hug their wives and children much more tightly than they did before. And who was it that the people on the doomed airliners called when they knew their end was near? It wasn't their brokers. It wasn't their bosses. It was their families. "I love you. Please forgive me. Think of me." You see, family counts when the chips are down. And then we are learning anew to appreciate our freedoms. We cherish our freedoms. I think especially, perhaps, the freedom from fear. You know from personal experience, as do I, that the sounds of sirens in this city, and indeed in New York City, no longer evoke the same response among the hearers that they did before. Troop mobilizations all around the world remind us that freedom isn't free. The sight of Old Glory and the strains of the national anthem once again bring tears to eyes that have long been dry. But there's a new sense of clarity, I believe, that has emerged in the aftermath of September 11 as Americans have once again begun to focus on the things that matter most: faith, family, and freedom. These are the bedrock virtues of American society. These are the eternal verities upon which our civilization has been based. They were virtues that formerly were deemed to be passé, but suddenly they're in fashion once again. And as we ask our best and brightest to prepare to die, to prepare to give their lives in sacrifice to save the American way of life. I think it's critical that we as a culture and we as a society ask ourselves, what is it about the American way of life that merits their giving up their lives to sustain it? It's a question, ladies and gentlemen, that we dare not fail to ask. Now, for several decades before the start of this war on terrorism, our country has been engaged in what some have dubbed the culture war. Now, the term war as it applies to the culture war may seem like an exaggeration in the face of a real shooting war that involves guns and bullets and explosives and perhaps weapons of mass destruction, but it is most assuredly a battle of ideas. It does involve undoubtedly a conflict of values, the outcome of which, in my judgment, may very well impact the war on terrorism or the outcome of the next shooting war to come down the pike. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, young men will not willingly walk into the valley of the shadow of death unless the prize to be gained is deemed to be worth it. General John Wickham, who was a former commander of the 101st Airborne Division and a former Army Chief of Staff, visited the battlefield at Antietam, where he positioned himself along what's called Bloody Lane, where in September of 1862, Confederate forces repulsed at great cost a number of Union assaults. General Wickham, standing there surveying the battlefield, marveled, you couldn't get American soldiers today to make an attack like that. Historian James McPherson, in explaining why Civil War soldiers would willingly march into murderous fire, climb over the mutilated bodies of their comrades, and hurl themselves against entrenched lines, said that they did it for principles, duty, honor, religious faith. Ask most young people today, present company accepted, ask most young people today, what would you be willing to die for? And I would submit to you that their answer is likely to depress. I've asked that question. It has been depressing. And so the question recurs, I think, what is it that we prize so highly? What is it that we hold so dear that we would ask our best and brightest to sacrifice their lives to defend? Ladies and gentlemen, it must be a virtuous society. Nothing less would make the sacrifice worthy. Nothing else would ennoble the losses of the injured and the dead. There must be a moral equivalency between the sacrifice and the object of that sacrifice. George Washington once said that the trail to Valley Forge could be traced by following the bloody footprints in the snow. Now, what is it that drove those courageous patriots to make such a sacrifice? What is it that drove the Army Rangers up the cliffs of Pont de Hoc on D-Day? What is it that made uncommon valor a common occurrence on the black sands of Iwo Jima? What drove the Marines forward in the icebound hell that came to be known as Chosin Reservoir? It was virtue. Young men and women will not sacrifice themselves in the full bloom of life unless there is something worth dying for. Virtue is the foundation of self-government. It is the seedbed of freedom and prosperity. And the bedrock virtues of American civilization have been family, faith, and freedom. Folks, I maintain that we can't ask our young people to go off and sacrifice their lives merely to defend a grasping consumerism. We can't expect mothers to kiss their sons on the cheek and send them off to war to protect the rights of pornographers to peddle their smut here in this country. Who would ask an aviator to fly into a blizzard of anti-aircraft fire so that pornographers could maintain the right to exploit their wives and children while they're away? Can we demand our soldiers enter the Moloch's maw of combat in order to protect the rights of people to kill innocent children in abortion clinics around the country? What is it that we're fighting for if it's not for a better, more virtuous nation? Then I submit to you that we are fools and knaves and perhaps even worse. The outcome of our internal culture war will, at some future date, I guarantee you, shape our will on the field of battle. And so at the Family Research Council, we contend for family, faith, and freedom. It's not just a catchy slogan, although it is our slogan. It really is a way of life. So we contend for religious liberty, to ensure that the rights of people to pray in public, no less so than in their prayer closets, is protected. We contend for the sanctity of life, notwithstanding the opposition of those who would cheapen innocent life through abortion and infanticide and euthanasia. We fight for the sanctity of marriage, notwithstanding the efforts of those who would devalue marriage by counterfeiting it and extending the sacred covenant to unions of homosexuals. We join conflict with pornographers who maintain that their view of the Constitution requires that they be permitted to pollute our environment with their smut. And yes, while we affirm that virtue is its own reward, we recognize that virtue inures to the benefit of the common good. Folks, do you really believe that when our troops from Delta Force crawl into the mouth of Osama bin Laden's cave or into the face of the muzzle of a terrorist machine gun, that they are doing so that women can kill their children, so that pornographers can peddle their smut, or so that people of the same sex can marry? If these features of American life become the fixtures of American life, then I fear that our great American experiment may not long endure. Benjamin Franklin observed, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom." May we be deserving of that freedom, for nothing less than the future of the American Republic is at stake. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Ken. He is willing to take a couple of questions. If there are questions that anybody wishes to address to Ken Connors, Ken, want to step up and pick them?
Thank you.
Just a few. Because
Yes, sir. All right.
Sir, would you comment on what appears to be a developing strategy on the part of the liberal side of the House or the Democrat side of the House, taking, quote, far-right Christians, unquote, and placing them in the same category as the radical Islamists?
Did you all hear the question? There clearly is a calculated plan. Howard Feynman of Newsweek reported on it recently, in which liberals in the Democratic Party will seek to equate American religious fundamentalists with the fundamentalists of the Taliban. And comment as we engage the forces of extreme fundamentalism abroad, we need to combat those same forces here at home. Indeed, increasingly you're seeing the Muslim extremists characterized as the religious right. The New York Times is using that term either consciously or unconsciously. You draw your own conclusions. But we know that language, he who controls the language controls the outcome of the debate. I think it's a risky political strategy because I do think Americans are appreciating anew the importance of the role of faith in our culture. Now, we have, in the Christian community, I think, been guilty of our own caricatures and stereotypes that have given plenty of ammunition to those who oppose our agenda. But the reality of it is, I think there is a conscious effort to demean religious people, to dispute the notion that there exists any kind of absolutes. Those of us who maintain that we are will be dismissed as absolutists. Who wants to be that? Dogmatists. And I think now during this time we have an unparalleled opportunity to reclaim the hearts and minds of the American people, to reestablish the importance of these eternal verities. And I think that our methods are every bit as important as our message. And I think this is a time for great charity, clarity, and magnanimity. Yes, sir.
Mr. Connor, I'm a former Floridian, saw you down there many times. I want to thank you for your efforts in trying to establish a two-party system in that state.
Thank you. At the Capital City Republican Club, we do mark Chappaquiddick Day annually in Tallahassee.
But I got to put you on the spot this morning. I'm convinced what I read down there and what I hear from my relatives and friends down there, that Janet Reno will be elected governor of the state this year. Am I right or wrong?
Well, I've got a 50-50 chance. I think Janet Reno will run a surprisingly strong race. Who would have thought that Florida would have been in play in the last presidential election? But it clearly was. Joe Lieberman was a very strong candidate, had great appeal to the Jewish communities of Miami, of Broward, Palm Beach, and Dade counties. The condo commandos were well organized and turned out in remarkably high levels. The black community had been upset and alienated by Jeb Bush's plans to eliminate affirmative action, if you will, and while they typically account for about 8% of the turnout, accounted for 16% of the turnout in Florida. And you know the rest of the story in terms of just how close it was. The other side has made Jeb Bush their number one target. They believe that he's vulnerable. What they didn't expect was that the president would be in as strong a position as he is today. And I'm convinced that'll carry a lot of ballast for Jeb, but the one thing we do know is that popular approval ratings are perishable. In order to sustain it, I think it's imperative that the president show the same guts and grits and determination on the domestic agenda that he's shown in this war on terror. But I do think that that's going to be an election that's very much in play. I think Jeb's a terrific governor, and I think he'll be a terrific candidate. It's hard to believe that Janet Reno really would have that kind of heft in Florida, but mark it down that there will be a national political campaign in the state of Florida aimed at defrocking the president's brother in the off-year election. Time for one more, Morton, or
There is
not?
one more.
Yes, sir?
I was wondering what you thought about Jerry Falwell's comments right after the attacks, and also Washington Post said that, Dana Milbach's article said that it's possible now that George W. Bush is
I was dismayed by Brother Falwell's remarks and responded in our daily update to those. I thought, first of all, that it's terribly presumptuous to presume to divine the mind of the Lord in the midst of a situation like that with that kind of specificity. And mark it down, I do believe that God judges men and nations, and that how we behave has eternal consequences, and that God can and does intervene in cultures to bless or punish based on the faithfulness or lack thereof of a culture. At the same time, I felt that the timing was bad as well. People were reeling from the attacks, and I felt that those comments were ill-timed and did not, at a time when I thought the spiritual antennas on people had gone up, and when they were probably more attuned to the significance of eternal consequences than ever before, and when the opportunity for those of us who believe that we have a commission to share Christ's love and the truth of the Bible with others, that had a very damaging effect. A very damaging effect. I don't doubt that President Bush is an authentic Christian. I feel confident that he has a deep, abiding faith. Christians and evangelicals should define themselves. And while I do think that President Bush is a man of great faith, I have difficulty sometimes reconciling and squaring his policies with what I believe are the implications of the Christian worldview. Most notably, for example, in the area of the sanctity of marriage. The homosexual community has made profound strides under the Bush administration. The Washington Blade hailed his decision to sign the D.C. appropriations bill as a huge victory for their movement. Notwithstanding that this president indicated during the campaign that he felt marriage was a sacred union and ought to be reserved to a man and a woman. I recognize that reasonable people and people of faith can disagree on a variety of sanctity of life issues, but I thought the president's decision on stem cell research was a profound mistake, and that he undercut himself in his defense against cloning, for example, by that. And I think the sanctity of life emerges out of the Judeo-Christian heritage and our belief that we're human beings made in the image of God, and that the ultimate price has been paid for our redemption. And so there is enormous and intrinsic worth and value that is attached to every human being, regardless of their age or stage of development. So, if President Bush becomes the standard bearer for the Christian community, and if his policies domestically continue down the same path, I think we are perhaps at greater risk than we ever were under the Clinton administration, because there we deemed ourselves to have a common foe, and when a good, solid conservative who's a man of faith gives up on some of the fundamentals of our movement, then I think the gains count for twice as much for the other side. Thank you, Morton.
Thank you. Ken, we really appreciate your coming, and we really appreciate your remarks. Among the things that we have learned from your remarks this morning is that a good trial lawyer can help us in a time of trial. And as a little token of our appreciation, I want to present to you one of our Leadership Institute Adam Smith neckties.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to invite you all to join us on Wednesday, February 6th Our next Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast speaker will be Judge Lauren Smith. He is now a senior judge, having stepped down as Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. He is one of the most interesting people in the conservative movement. As you will see when you come to the breakfast, and I really urge you to come. You will find it a fascinating experience listening to Judge Smith. Now, those of you who are our guests this morning who would like a tour of the building, we always offer tours of the building immediately after these breakfasts. Eric Putman is standing back there, meaning people here can't see you, but Eric Putman, who's in a dark conservative suit with a white shirt on and a name tag. Huh? He'll work his way up here. He'll lead that tour, take you through the building. We're very proud of our building and that our donors have made possible, because we are able to do a whole lot more than we were ever able to do before we had the building. His tour will start immediately as we break up, which is, ladies and gentlemen, right now. Thank you all.